we have got a lot to talk about here today, and it is not the conversation we want to be having. Good morning, everybody. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Reports out there, more substantial than rumors, obviously, that Dylan Raiola is on the verge of flipping away from Georgia in kind of a late push by Nebraska. What is going on here? What does all of this mean? We're going to do our best to sort of figure all of this out here over the course of the next couple of minutes. I'm going to give you kind of my vantage point for how I view the news. Sometimes what you hear and what you don't hear is equally important. We'll talk about what that means and kind of what this also means for Georgia in the immediate future when it comes to the football team here in 2024, if this does indeed go down. So we'll try to figure this out. Conor Riley going to help us with that there as well. We'll make some room for your comments at the end here as a part of our R.S. Andrews cooldown. And it sort of feels like sometimes in kind of the cooldown aspect of the show, it can be just a little bit more sort of free-flowing and candid. So we'll try to do some of that here coming up in a little bit and just sort of like kind of get it all out there and sort of figure out where it is all going. So let's throw it out there. Let's see what sticks. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I think most of us have had a sense for quite some time that we are in the midst of a new age of college football. Change is all around us, and not all of us think all of the change is for the better. And this is maybe never more true than the news cycle we're kind of watching unfold here right now with sort of the late push by Nebraska for five-star quarterback, longtime Georgia commit Dylan Raiola, who spent his senior season at Buford High School, just a few miles down the road from Athens, Georgia. So let's talk about what we do know, and then we'll see if we can kind of fill in the gaps of what we think all of this means here. For those of you who maybe missed the action last night or have kind of been, just sort of depending on a show like this, going to get you up to date on everything, let's do our due diligence to do just that. We're going to start here with Steve Wiltfong. Wiltfong is a longtime recruiting analyst for 24/7 Sports, probably one of the more famous, I would say, like national recruiting analysts from the standpoint of, 24/7 Sports has what's known as their crystal balls. This is just a marketing, description for their online predictions. When a prediction is made, they called it a crystal ball. And last night on Twitter, Wiltfong put this out. Let me read this to you here for a moment about what Steve Wiltfong from 24/7 Sports said, that he had flipped my 24/7 Sports crystal ball to Nebraska for five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola. When a guy like Wiltfong does that, that's obviously a really big deal. Now, I'm going to get to in a moment what it means that Wiltfong did this via Twitter in such a public fashion. I think there's an element of that that's pretty important, but let me kind of work my way to get there by saying this. A lot of Georgia fans, when they hear something like this, maybe they only halfway follow recruiting or they're busy. It's Christmas time. You're trying to buy gifts. You're trying to do all that kind of stuff. When you hear something like this going on, I think your first question is this real? Is this just rumor and innuendo? Is this just a way to kind of build interest for signing period, which begins next week, or, subscriptions to websites, things like that? Is what's going on here? Is this real? Is this matter of fact? Is this to be taken at face value? And I can tell you that my interpretation of the news on this pretty quickly would be that, yeah, you ought to be able to take this at face value. You ought to take this very, very seriously. A guy like Steve Wiltfong is probably not doing this in such a public manner unless he had very strong reason to believe that's the case. And if there is any doubt whatsoever about the veracity of this claim, keep in mind this, that Dylan Raiola could end all of this right now by coming out and saying, I don't know where this is coming from. I mean, let's keep this in mind. When Fran Brown, the former Georgia cornerbacks coach, when he announced he was going to go to Syracuse, I mean, obviously the first question a lot of folks would have asked on a show like this is, well, what does this mean for an elite cornerback commit to Georgia like Ellis Robinson? Robinson, pound for pound, maybe the most prized of all of the Georgia 2024 commits. And when his position coach leaves to go to Syracuse, the first thought a lot of folks would have is, oh gosh, does this put Robinson's future at Georgia at jeopardy, especially given the fact that he took a relatively late visit in the process to Miami? And if there was ever a guy that might, sort of conjure up a lot of NIL type deals, a guy like Robinson might do that. And many of you remember, because we talked about this on the show, Ellis Robinson, in the midst of all that uncertainty that some fans had about his status as a Georgia commit, he stepped up right away and he gave that tweet that had the dog emoji on it. And a lot of us sort of speak social media now these days, and that was clearly an indication that Ellis Robinson had plans to stay at Georgia, and the concerns that he might be looking around with Fran Brown being on the move. That tweet, as much of a confirmation as we can have here in 2024, that tweet, or X if you want to call that, kind of served as our confirmation that Robinson had plans to stay at Georgia. He put those rumors to rest by coming out and giving you a relatively short, brief social media post. Everyone knew how to interpret that. So if we don't hear anything like this, and I suspect we won't, if we don't hear anything like that from Dylan Raiola over the course of the next 24 hours, then all of a sudden you start taking this very, very seriously, and that indeed there is a very strong chance that Raiola could be on the move, going back to Nebraska, the place that he does have long-standing family ties. Obviously, we know his father, Dominic, played at Nebraska. We know that his uncle is offensive line coach at Nebraska, and as many folks have kind of pointed out, Dylan's uncle just got a big raise to stay at Nebraska. I believe he was the only assistant coach that Matt Rule kept when Rule became a head coach there at Nebraska. So, all of a sudden these family connections become very real again, and this becomes one of those things all of a sudden people are kind of remembering, oh yeah, he does have this tie and he does have that tie, in the face of the news that kind of came out yesterday. Now, the other interpretation that I think that you make on this is that it's fairly obvious that all of this is happening very, very quickly, not just because the Wiltfong thing, and I know that Chad Simmons had some reporting on this too, but the Wiltfong thing kind of comes, kind of completely out of nowhere. We can also trace this back to a couple of days ago. Do you remember when Georgia went in home with the five-star athlete from Buford, KJ Bolden? And, you obviously get one in-home visit there, and Georgia using one there. Will Muschamp, Kirby Smart going to visit Bolden. Bolden, obviously a pretty high-profile recruit that got away from Georgia a few months ago when he went to Florida State. But clearly Georgia's still recruiting Bolden. The presence of the in-home visit kind of shows you that. And Dylan Raiola, who was a high school teammate of Bolden's this past year, was also on social media, kind of encouraging KJ Bolden to follow him to Georgia. So we would presume, because it wouldn't make any sense for Raiola to be recruiting for Georgia like that publicly while he knew he was going to Nebraska. So whatever kind of has gone on here between Raiola and Nebraska has pretty clearly happened very late in the process. I mean, within the last couple of days, because it was only a couple of days ago that Dylan was out there on social media very publicly being in favor of UGA, which would be a pretty strange thing for a guy to do if he wasn't, and at the time if he knew he wasn't planning on going to Georgia, or even if he was considering not going to Georgia. That'd be a pretty strange thing to do. So I think we're left to kind of connect the clues there on this and assume that all of this with Raiola and Nebraska has happened very, very late, very, very quickly. And the other assumption we're going to make, and then we're going to kind of walk towards the finish line on this. The other assumption we're going to make is that almost all of this chatter as it relates to Dylan and Nebraska, because they're kind of three camps here. There's the Georgia camp, there's the Raiola family camp, and there's the Nebraska camp. In any kind of situation like this where a quarterback is perhaps leaving the current school to go to a new school, there's sort of three different factions you could hear from. You could hear from Georgia, you could hear from the Raiola camp itself, or you could hear from Nebraska. I think we can assume that the entirety of this news cycle is made up of not Raiola sources or not Georgia sources. I think we can assume almost the entirety of this news cycle is made up of Nebraska-based sources. I'm going to tell you why I think that's important. Let me show you this. First of all, this comes from Pete Thamel. This is not a normal recruiting reporter. Thamel's just sort of a basic news guy for ESPN. But in light of kind of what came out with Steve Wiltfong and the crystal ball pick for Nebraska on Dylan Raiola, you also yesterday had Pete Thamel coming out to say that Nebraska coaches have communicated with in-state quarterback commitment Daniel Kalen, that's the guy that was already committed to Nebraska, that they're again in contention for a commitment from top 10 recruit Dylan Raiola, who is committed to UGA. Nebraska coaches have made clear that they would still honor Kalen's commitment. So I'm going to read between the lines on what Thamel puts out there and say that what Thamel's getting in terms of what's going on there is coming from the Nebraska coaches themselves. They're saying to Thamel, hey, we've told this guy that all is good here. We're going to honor his scholarship. Now, obviously, that doesn't probably make the quarterback in question here feel very loved, but nonetheless, that's what they're saying. Hey, we've told him we're going to honor his scholarship. We're doing this kind of by the book here. So it sort of reads between the lines to me that Thamel sources on this and the Nebraska coaches. So if the Nebraska coaches are talking to Pete Thamel, it sort of stands to reason they'd be talking to Steve Wiltfong as well. Once again, I don't know this to be sure. Obviously, none of these guys reveal their sources. I'm just talking about what kind of makes sort of common sense in all of this, because keep in mind, Steve Wiltfong works for a subscription-based website. You know, this is one of those deals where you go to the behind the paywall to the message board or whatever else to sort of find out what's going on. The fact that Wiltfong puts this out on Twitter for the entire world to see, and not just the paying customers of 24/7 Sports to see, once again, you sort of take that as sort of a read between the lines of whoever gave this information to Wiltfong wanted it to be public. They wanted it to be known the world over. And obviously, I think that sort of only benefits the Nebraska coaches here. And to sort of further this point a little bit more, let me show you this from a different company. This is On3. The guy we've talked about before, Hayes Fawcett, the sort of famous like graphic maker, I guess you would call him, artist, perhaps he would prefer to be known as. He puts it out there that five-star quarterback Dylan Raiola will take an official visit this weekend to Nebraska, a source tells me. So once again, you've kind of got folks sort of saying here, hey, on behalf of, kind of everything that goes down, perhaps from the Nebraska side, that we're in the market for Raiola. We got a chance to do this. So go out there publicly that we think we're going to flip him, or let it be known this, let it be known that. It just sort of seems like a lot of the energy around all of this is sort of coming from the Nebraska side. So if that is indeed true, which obviously we're kind of making some assumptions on, but if that were indeed true, the question you would ask yourself is, well, why does Nebraska want all of this to be so public? Because there was a day and age that if you were really, making a move in recruiting, remember the phrase you sometimes heard about, like moving in silence, what is the people say real G's move in silence? Well, this is not Nebraska moving in silence. They pretty clearly are benefiting from something about this being very, very loud, very, very public. So why do they want the world to know? Oftentimes when Georgia's had visitors on campus, they've done everything they could to keep that secret, whether it's, trying to attend a game without somebody being, fully aware of that, or taking a visit without somebody being fully aware of that. Why does Nebraska want all of this to be so public? Well, I think we can trace this back, if you want to make the assumption here anyway. I think you can trace this back to something that Nebraska coach Matt Rule said the other day. It got a lot of attention at the time, and I want to play it for you now. Now, I took this off of one of the social media platforms. Somebody put a couple sound effects here on this. But nonetheless, this is Matt Rule talking about the market for, he was describing the time, transfer quarterbacks, and how high dollar that market is if you want one of the best transfer quarterbacks. Was this, at the time, Matt Rule planting a seed for what his program wants to do now when it comes to Dylan Raiola? Take a listen to this.
Make no mistake that a good quarterback in the portal costs $1 million to $1.5 million to $2 million right now. So just on the same page, right? So let's make sure we all understand what's happening. So there's some teams that have six or $7 million players playing for them.
So that's Matt Rule saying, hey, if you want one of the best quarterbacks right now, you got to go out and spend $1 million or $1.5 million or $2 million on that quarterback. Now, it's fair to point out that a lot of people at the time that Rule said that's probably still an exaggeration. We're obviously in a day and age in which top players are certainly demanding big dollar sums, and many of them are getting big dollar sums. But there's an aspect of what Rule said there that I think plugged in source within the sport are saying is probably still a little bit of an exaggeration. But nonetheless, this is Rule out there just seemingly sort of speaking off the cuff of, hey, you want a great quarterback? That's a 7-figure proposition. That may be multiples of millions of dollars worth of a proposition if you want to be able to do that. So here's how I connect the dots on this, and perhaps this is not true, but here's how I connect the dots in all of this. It certainly seems like to me that Nebraska wanted as much public chatter out there as possible about the fact they were going to get a chance to host Dylan Raiola on an official visit, with the idea that if they can raise enough money from some of the boosters, and Nebraska, by the way, is a very large fan base with a lot of boosters. Nebraska's sort of been thought to be a pretty significant player in the NIL space. They don't have much to sell in terms of recent football success. You got to go back to the 1990s to find Nebraska being very good. It's obviously a freezing cold place to live, not the most exciting community necessarily, but they do have a big fan base. They are starved for winning, and they have a chance to raise a lot of NIL dollars. This has been true for Nebraska for quite some time. It's one of the reasons why a guy like Matt Rule would have taken that job, because there is an NIL base in place. And I believe what Nebraska is trying to do right now by making all of this very public, open public prediction on the part of Steve Wiltfong, information about how they're going about all of this, including getting, Raiola on campus here this weekend. This is all in an attempt to create a very large NIL package, raise the money perhaps they've insinuated as a possibility here, spending big on the hopes they can take Raiola away from Georgia. And if we look at, previous, recent history for Georgia on some of this kind of stuff, if the offer from Nebraska is big enough, the odds are Georgia will not match that, because that's just not quite the way that Georgia has gone about its business in this space in the past. Georgia believes they have a good quarterback already committed in this class, and I think by now he's essentially a signee. When it comes to, Ryan Puglisi, Georgia's obviously had back-to-back national championship success. As a program, they are not nearly as desperate as perhaps Nebraska is for that level of success. What should Georgia do as it relates to Dylan Raiola? Different people probably have different opinions, but it certainly seems like all of this being done by Nebraska in a very public way to raise a lot of dollars in the hopes they can buy Dylan from Georgia here late in the process. Now, I think this tells us a lot about kind of where things stand with college football, what this means, I think, in terms of our understanding of Raiola in particular, and it also starts a conversation about what about Carson Beck and his future there at Georgia. There are a lot of big questions that get asked on, the other side of the idea that Nebraska is trying to use a big NIL offer to kind of wrestle Raiola away. And so on all of that, in terms of exactly how Georgia fans are supposed to feel about this, I want to keep that conversation going, but first, let me take some time to introduce our show. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Happy to have you with us. All video platforms, of course, we start 10 a.m., 9:45, 1st and 15 there on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app, radio app, and Sports Radio 960 Ref, podcast, all the podcast platforms there as well. Just happy to have you with us no matter which platform you choose to use. Big thanks to our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia who make it all possible for you there as well. Foundation, waterproofing problems, obviously, that's what Engineered Solutions of Georgia lives to solve for you. And one of the things I hope that my words throughout the years have reminded you of is that there are some signs here that ought to trigger in your head, oh yeah, BA said ESOG when I see an issue like this. I'm talking about water creeping in where it's not supposed to be. Wet spots in the basement, crawl space, garage. All of those issues can be signs of a bigger problem. And when you see that, I want you to think about Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Or those cracks, walls, certainly easy to notice that if it's the basement floor, but also if there's a horizontal crack in the sheetrock, or if there's one of those sort of stair-step cracks, the thing that goes down and over, down and over, down and over on the brick on the outside of your house. Once again, that ought to be a trigger to you, Engineered Solutions of Georgia, because they are your solution for foundation waterproofing issues. In fact, the word solution is right there in their name. They exist to solve these kind of problems for you. Simple problems, big problems, everything else in between. They're also proud partners of UGA there as well. It's always fun to do business with those who support UGA. Clearly, that's what Engineered Solutions of Georgia is all about. Longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily there as well, including, again, for 2024, too. We're very, very excited about all of that with our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia, because they've got an entire team of engineers on staff. There's nobody else in our marketplace that puts that level of support towards your problem like our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia are able to do. So give them a call. The phone number, very easy to remember. Simply dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. Engineered Solutions of Georgia, a solution to your foundation and waterproofing issues. Proud partners of UGA, longtime friends of ours here on DawgNation Daily. We're going to get Conor Riley here coming up in just a moment, and we'll talk to Conor, his perspective on a lot of this. He's written some good stuff already about this there at DawgNation.com. But for now, let's go around the doghouse as a lead-in to all of that. And here's what I'm going to tell you, which is I know there's a temptation on the part of a lot of Georgia fans to say, well, you just got to pay Dylan Raiola whatever he wants. You can't lose a recruit this late in the process, Nebraska, if this is an NIL thing, then Georgia's got to just sort of dig deep and go to some of their money bag boosters and say, hey, we need you to sort of reach down and sort of give more money because we got to win this Raiola recruiting battle. And I certainly understand where that comes from. And I think we all have to kind of make peace with the idea that the recruiting process is probably changed forever when it comes to the sort of premium positions. Quarterback, those that protect quarterback like offensive tackles, those that receive the football from quarterback like wide receivers, those that get after quarterbacks like edge rushers, and those that defend the pass from quarterbacks like cornerbacks. There are some, I think, understood premium positions, and moving forward, the NIL stuff is just going to be a factor in this recruitment. And while it's great to have principles of, well, we reserve our NIL funds for the players who've been here and earned it and whatever, that's great. There's also a degree to which reality has to be confronted on its terms. And while it's great to have principles, it's also a requirement to have the kind of elite talent that keeps you in the national championship business. And it is probably true to a degree here that Georgia is going to, I would assume anyway, in the future have to embrace some of the reality around NIL in a way that to this point they haven't really had to do because they've had the deep and talented roster. They were kind of in the driver's seat position because of the success they were having on the field. But as you start thinking about transitioning to future years, kind of playing in the space based on the rules that have been established, that's going to probably be just as true for Georgia as it is for anybody else. They may be in a position right now where they can not get into the bidding war over Raiola, and perhaps that makes some sense to do because I don't know that anybody is. I can't miss prospect, Raiola included. I mean, I think that we've said now many times that on a future Georgia quarterback situation, well, I think that Raiola would have a very good chance to win, and become an eventual starting quarterback at Georgia, much the same way a guy like Carson Beck used his experience to win that job this year. By the way, more on Beck here in a moment. Much the way a guy like that used his experience to win the job this year, I would trust someone like Gunnar Stockton, who's been in the program for quite some time. That if it was a Stockton versus Raiola battle, you've heard me say this before, wasn't obvious to me that Dylan Raiola would be a huge favorite to win that battle, given the way in which experiences seem to matter when it comes to success there at Georgia. So while it's probably true that eventually Georgia's going to have to be more aggressive for the kind of premium positions in recruiting to keep pace with those who are willing to do that, maybe right now spending an outsized portion of its NIL budget, if you want to call it that, on a guy like Raiola, maybe that doesn't make as much sense for UGA here right now. That if previous history is our guide, that Georgia probably will not quite go to the 11th hour in a negotiation. If Nebraska is driving up the price based on its current actions right now, then Georgia would probably take a step back. I think that's what you would be left to conclude. That's kind of perhaps the way that's done here right now. And in terms of how you interpret and how you make sense of all of this, here's what I'll say about Dylan Raiola. That it is certainly understandable if he indeed does make this move. It is certainly understandable why someone like this would make this decision. If it's more money, if it's more whatever, well, it's easy for all of us to assume in that same spot we would make the same decision. It is clearly understandable. But it's also important to point out here that not everything that's understandable is also honorable. And I would say that after, coming every Georgia game and, being a big part of the ongoing conversation with UGA recruits, we know a lot of recruits have sort of visited Raiola for Buford games, things like that. This late in the process, presumably without a whole lot of contact with anybody else involved here to make this sort of 11th hour decision to kind of do an about face and all of that, it may be understandable if he's getting a big payday for doing it. But if he does this, I don't believe that's particularly honorable. I don't have a problem sort of saying that out loud. I'm not sure I'd make a different decision. In fact, I'm probably sure I'd make the very same decision. But just because it's a common decision, easy for anyone to make, doesn't mean it's necessarily a laudable decision. I would say in this particular case, that's probably what's true here. I think it's also a reminder for all of us that kind of care about Georgia football and care about these kinds of things, and this has sort of been true forever, that it's fun to follow recruiting. It's obviously important to understand recruiting as the lifeblood for what makes a team kind of on the championship level. But, kind of getting too enamored with any individual recruit is probably always a mistake because of the way in which that these decisions can sometimes be fickle. So following recruiting, I think, is a necessity if you want to understand what's truly going on in college football. But following a recruit and putting a whole lot of your sort of vested interest in a fan in any one recruit, that's probably never a very wise thing to do, whether you're talking about the 2024 recruiting class or any class that kind of came before all of that. Probably kind of, important to give yourself a reminder on that perhaps one more time. Now, last thing, then we're going to bring on Conor Riley. Fair to wonder, what does all of this mean for Carson Beck? And is it perhaps true that the chatter that's been out there of, well, Brock Vandagriff leaving and going to Kentucky, that's a hint that Carson Beck is returning, and Dylan Raiola flirting with Nebraska, that's a hint that Carson Beck is returning? I would say that conventional wisdom would lead us to believe, of course that's true. Almost everything that we've heard as of late would seem to reinforce the idea that Beck is probably coming back, that Vandagriff left, that Raiola's looking around. Jeff Sentell had some reporting at DawgNation yesterday that Carson participated in bowl practices that have started up for Georgia, getting ready for the Orange Bowl against Florida State. A guy that was leaving may not be, doing something like that right now. That might be a different kind of decision. If you're truly going to the NFL, playing in this Orange Bowl, perhaps that's something that Carson Beck might not do. So there is certainly plenty of circumstantial evidence right now that would lead you to believe that Carson Beck is probably returning. But I want to be very honest about this. I began the show today by saying, hey, the fact that Dylan Raiola isn't putting all these rumors to bed is perhaps an indication that there's some truth to these rumors, that if Raiola wanted to let everybody know that I'm not going to Nebraska, it's freezing cold in Nebraska. I had every chance to go to Nebraska prior to coming to Georgia. No, I'm not doing that. If he wanted to do that, it'd be very easy for him to do that. The fact that he's not, that kind of tells you something. I would say perhaps there is a similar thing that could also be true for Carson Beck here. That if Carson Beck really is ready to run it back, as we've always liked to say, for the 2024 season, right now would be a great time to say that. If Beck is really coming back, if Beck is ready to go for 2024, if Georgia's got its starting quarterback figured out for this upcoming year, and then after that we'll kind of figure out, backups and future, quarterback hierarchy after that, then right now is a very good time to make that announcement. And if that announcement doesn't come sometime in the next couple of days here, then I think you're left to conclude that, not that it means he's definitely leaving, but it kind of gives credence to the idea of what some sources also told Jeff Sentell yesterday, that as of right now, Beck really doesn't know what he's going to do. And that he really is still contemplating the idea that he's a high enough draft pick in the 2024 draft to warrant leaving. So just sort of keep that in mind. When it comes to kind of following the news and paying attention to what's going on, what is said is really important. But sometimes it's equally important to listen to the dog that isn't barking. And if we go a few days without hearing anything definitive from Carson Beck, then I'd say, as a Georgia fan, that might be reason to get a little bit anxious about what the eventual decision might end up being. My assumption is Beck will probably stay for 2024, and that Georgia will go on to have a great season with him. And the future quarterback decisions of, is it Gunnar Stockton? Is it Ryan Puglisi? Is it perhaps Dylan Raiola, who changes his mind at the 11th hour, just decides to stay at Georgia? That all of that is some sort of future decision to be worried about in some future year. That we are kind of in the win now era of college football, that it's all about what can I do to get my team ready for this upcoming season, and we'll let the future sort of take care of itself. And if that be the case, if that's what we're really heading towards, and I think fans are pretty comfortable with that conversation already as it is. So a lot of the energy now for Georgia is going to center around what Carson Beck eventually announces. Obviously, Georgia fans hope that he stays. Georgia fans hope that he's here for 2024. And the Beck decision, whenever it comes, is obviously more important, we would believe, than almost anything Dylan Raiola is going to say in future days there as well. So we'll follow both stories. We'll see where they go, and we'll call that Around the Doghouse here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Now, before we're done, for the people who say, well, clearly, Dylan Raiola doesn't want to stay at Georgia if he thinks Carson Beck is coming back, because that ruins his opportunity to kind of perhaps step in as sort of a day one starter, or at least a first-year starter there at UGA. That, from a conventional wisdom standpoint, almost seems like it could be true, but there's also an aspect of the story there in Nebraska that many of you are perhaps aware of that kind of causes you to wonder, well, how true is that really based on some other news that's out there related to the Huskers? We'll get to that before we're done on the show. But for now, the rest of the information related to what really is going on with Dylan Raiola and kind of where all this is going from here, let's bring on Conor Riley today as a part of DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, let's bring on Conor Riley here. A lot to talk about. Conor's written plenty. I guess, Conor, let me work backwards here, and then we'll kind of get to all of this. What I just said a moment ago is that obviously the Dylan Raiola rumors and reports that are out there, seem to be in some way connected to whatever Carson Beck's going to do because it's the same position, if nothing else. And so what I said is, hey, if Carson Beck really is coming back to Georgia, then, boy, I tell you, right now would be a really good time to announce that. So do we read something into this if we go a few more days without Carson saying something about his status for 2024? Is that dog that wouldn't be barking there perhaps telling for Georgia if it does stretch on that long?
No, to me, because, and I actually think this is kind of similar to the Brock Vandagriff situation where he announces he's going into portal and then ultimately ends up at Kentucky. A lot of people at the time thought that was in connection to Carson Beck electing to come back another year, when in reality, I think these are two independent things of each other at this point in time. I think that with Carson, he's going to make his own decision. He's still weighing his options. I'll note, right now, I don't really see him as a first-round quarterback prospect. Maybe some teams do. It only takes one, obviously. But, and there's an ESPN mock draft article out today. Caleb Williams and Drake May go 1-2. Jaden Daniels is a first-round quarterback, and I think he has clearly elevated himself above Beck in that pecking order. And then, you have that next sort of tier with guys like J.J. McCarthy, Michael Penix, Bo Nix, and Carson Beck. And one thing to keep in mind with Carson, he's got about 250 fewer pass attempts than J.J. McCarthy, who has the next fewest amount of pass attempts. Like, he's just so much more of an unknown in that standpoint. So I think this is a difficult decision for him because I absolutely do believe, and I believe Carson believes this as well, he has NFL-level tools, but the big thing missing from him, especially in comparison to other players out there, is just the experience factor. Bo Nix, 6-year starter. Michael Penix started over the course of 6 years. Even McCarthy is a guy who played a big role on that 2021 Michigan team that went to the college football playoff. This is really Beck's only first year as a starter here. And in turn, going to the Raiola news, based on my sort of read of this, I think that, while yes, I do think the fact that Georgia maybe said what their options would be in the event that Carson Beck does elect to go pro, I think there are a lot of other factors around this that is leading Raiola to ultimately, I believe, end up at Nebraska this time around.
So I want to talk about all of that here coming up in a moment. Let me give you, I guess, one more question on Beck kind of before we get there. I try to talk to people who know more about this kind of stuff than I do, which sometimes is not very hard to find. Plenty of people certainly do. And in talking to people who kind of knew more about Beck than me over the course of the last few months, let me tell you what I kind of heard kind of piecing this together, and I want you to tell me how true you think this is. At one point in time, you go back a few months ago, you talk to people, you think Carson Beck might come back for 2024? What I had sort of heard at the time was, no, Beck is just ready. He's just been in college now for a long time. He's just sort of anxious to go into the NFL, sort of try his hand at the league. And then he started playing so well that all of a sudden how he was being evaluated by draft scouts seemingly started to matter more because all of a sudden now he's playing well enough that he's on the radar in a way that he just wasn't when this year began. Beck was not on anybody's radar for the most part in terms of NFL draft future, I would say, when this year began. A guy that would have been drafted, of course, but not a guy that, would have, certainly no one was talking very much about Carson Beck when the season began. But when you're playing the way that Carson mostly played this year, all of a sudden you are in a little bit of a different NFL draft conversation. And all of a sudden, to me, it seems like because Beck has played well enough to get some attention, the idea that coming back for another year and getting even more attention, that seems like more of a real possibility. Is that sort of the sense that you got, that as Beck has played better, he sort of realizes that, hey, the more I do play better, the more my draft stock may come up, and all of a sudden a guy who at one point in time there were some whispers, maybe he doesn't want to come back. Now there's some whispers, actually, he might really want to come back because of what he could be in 2025 if he did. Is that sort of the read that you get on that situation?
don't think it's outrageous for Carson Beck to be the number 1 overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft. Now, obviously, a lot has to go right between now and then, but I think if he continues to get better, and it is, in my opinion, clearly a weaker quarterback class next year than it is this year. Not just at the top, the obvious names. There's no obvious 2025 guy there. Even some of the other guys that are being mentioned along with Beck already have some questions. Shedeur Sanders, who some potentially sees a first-round pick this year, but it seems pretty clear he's going to come back to Colorado next year. Colorado is a very difficult situation to assess, in my opinion, because of just the offense and the way that changed this year and how poor his offensive line was. The other guy, Quinn Ewers, a guy that's battled injury, a guy that has been up and down over the course of his college career, and you look at past players that come from that Steve Sarkisian offense. They haven't exactly had the easiest transition into the NFL. And so I think, Beck has a real chance next year to play himself into a no doubt about it first-round pick, something he is not right now, in my opinion. And so, yeah, the offense, he's going to be tasked to do more next year, and there are pros and cons that come with that. But I think if Carson is willing to bet on himself big in a way to where, the payoff could be not just winning a national championship as a starting quarterback, but also the, $30 million that come from being a second, third, fourth round pick compared to what you get at being at the top of the NFL draft. So I do think that as he played better, it was always going to be an impossibility for Carson Beck to really be a top of the line first round quarterback this year, because he wasn't going to have the snaps, and you already had 2 really established prospects in Caleb Williams and Drake May. There aren't those same level of established prospects next year, and Carson Beck actually could go on to become that guy. I think if he elects to come back and continues to make strides that at times we saw him make this year.
All right, so moving on to Dylan Raiola here for a moment. When you look at the timeline, just a few days ago, Dylan was at least on social media doing some sort of rah-rahing for Georgia as it related to K.J. Bolden's recruitment, at least making some sort of public statements in favor of UGA there and all of that. I think it becomes somewhat easy to assume then that whatever lack of certainty has existed around Raiola's future with the Dogs has only been within the last couple of days. And when you look at the way the news cycle kind of unfolded, a lot of this seeming to come from the Nebraska side on all of this, I sort of read this as all of this has changed because at the very end of the process here, Nebraska seemingly has gotten very aggressive in trying to raise a whole bunch of money to essentially buy Dylan away from UGA. Is that kind of the read that you get on this too?
Not just Dylan. His uncle, Donovan Raiola, is the offensive line coach in Nebraska. He very recently got a new raise in his job there, and Nebraska went 5-7 this year. It's not like there was a whole lot to celebrate there. When it comes to Raiola, you can tell yourself that Georgia's going to try and retain him. I do believe they're going to try and do that because they do believe in the talent. But let's just look at some facts here. Dylan Raiola was expected to enroll and be at Georgia Bowl practice on Saturday. There are going to be other 2024 signees in Athens, getting acclimated. Ryan Puglisi is expected to be one of them. Raiola was expected to be in Athens this weekend. He will now be taking an official visit to Nebraska this weekend. I think that speaks a lot to the way and where this thing is trending. And as you, I think, point out, on Thursday he was with K.J. Bolden, with the Georgia coaches, trying to recruit him. By Monday evening, it became sort of clear that he was going to probably end up at Nebraska. So something over the course of this weekend has, I think, clearly impacted the way Raiola has viewed his college decision there. And look, he just means probably more Nebraska than he does at Georgia. Georgia has been a program that has built itself on not being reliant on a quarterback to win. I think that was true in 2021 and 2022. And even at times this year in 2023 under Carson Beck. Georgia doesn't want to put everything on the shoulders of the quarterback. Since 2016, that was Kirby Smart's first year at Georgia, he has won 2 national championships. Nebraska has 1 winning season in that time. It just, not to use the stupid SEC cliche, it just means more to Nebraska to have Dylan Raiola than it does to Georgia. And so I think you clearly see Nebraska saying, hey, we're going to throw everything we have at this and try and make an impact and try and land him. And because of some uncertainty at the Georgia quarterback position right now in the future, and I think it's fair to say there is some uncertainty. We still don't know what Carson Beck is going to do. I think Nebraska has capitalized on that and made it very big and what I think will ultimately be a very successful push to land the 5-star quarterback.
So I want to talk about what this means for fans, and then I want to talk about what this means for Georgia perhaps going forward. On the fan part of this, Connor, we don't trash really any players, whether they play for Georgia or play for anybody else, but that's just not really what we do around here. We're a little bit harder on coaches because we just sort of think of them as full-fledged adults. Players we're pretty light touch with for the most part, and Dylan Raiola, that's going to be true there as well. However, I will say that while I think it's very understandable if they're offering you tons of money, more money than Georgia's offering, it's very understandable why you would take that. Perhaps in the same situation, we would all do the exact same thing. That's what makes it understandable. But just because it's understandable doesn't mean it's honorable. And, this late, after spending an entire year on campus, coming to every Georgia game, being in regular conversation with Georgia recruits, to do something like this right before you're supposed to go to Georgia, I would say that Connor fans are within their rights not to like that. I don't think they should trash Raiola on social media or trash him anywhere. I think there's a way to behave even when you're unhappy. But I think fans are within their rights here to say, this ain't it. This is not how business ought to be conducted, even if the business of making money for yourself is somewhat understandable. There's still a way to do things. This doesn't quite feel like the way that things ought to be done.
7 months ago, Dylan
I think we may have lost Connor. I want to get him back on there because I want him to finish the point that he's making on all of this. So we may have lost him. But obviously, I think he's going to make reference to the fact that, Raiola at the beginning of the school year makes the move from Arizona to Georgia to play here at Buford. I'm not one of these that necessarily makes a huge deal necessarily about that transfer. My understanding is he was going to be, I guess, because of Arizona rules, unable to play, for the school that he was at. I don't know what that means for the transfer prior to that kind of led that to take place. I don't have a lot of information on that. But for a senior that if you're not able to play at your current place to go to a new place seems to make some sense. But kind of let me bring you back in on this about how fans ought to feel about such a late decision from Raiola, even if it's a financially lucrative one for him.
Yeah, no, I don't know where I got cut off there, but the whole Raiola recruitment has been weird. The last 3 Ohio State quarterbacks have been first-round picks: Dwayne Haskins, Justin Fields, C.J. Stroud. Raiola commits to go there, and then ultimately backs off for reasons that were kind of murky, and then commits to Georgia, two-time defending national champion, a place where you can go and win, and along the way get developed into an NFL-level quarterback. Stetson Bennett was drafted in the 4th round last year. Carson Beck looks to have been developed into an NFL-level quarterback. You're playing against NFL guys every day in practice, and then at the 11th hour, you sort of back off that commitment there. He is someone who bounced around at different high schools, moved across the country to be closer to Georgia, but then, as you point out, at the 11th hour, and an incredibly curiously timed Instagram post that he shared last night, thanking everyone for his time at Buford, the whole 6 months that he had spent there.
Right.
The whole thing is just, it's a very strange recruitment. And look, and some of this, I think, falls at the feet of the adults around Dylan more so than him himself. We're all products of our environment here, and I think to a certain aspect, Raiola, the adults around Raiola have sort of led him into this predicament where, fairly or not, he is getting hate on social media, and I don't believe you should ever be tweeting at 17, 18-year-old recruits about where they think they should go to college. But the adults, as you pointed out, and you sort of led on in discussing how we talk about, kids, athletes, college football players on the show, the adults around Dylan Raiola, I think, in some regard, have failed him here. And if, Nebraska, Dylan Raiola's dad is a Nebraska legend, longtime NFL player, Dominic Raiola. If he knew that he always wanted his kid to go to Nebraska, you probably should have just let him there in the first place. And obviously you want to let Dylan make his own decision. But, at this stage, at this hour, is that really what's going on? Again, as is often the case in some of these recruitments, the more high profile they are, sometimes the adults get in the way of the kids, and the kids, fairly or not, end up getting a lot of the backlash there.
Let me squeeze in one more thing on the Dylan part of this before I talk more broadly about the Georgia part of this. And this is kind of a dumb thing to say maybe, but it's one of the things that kind of pops in my mind. When you looked at Dylan while he was in Athens for games here this year, boy, from a body language standpoint, you never could have predicted something like this was coming. And I'll make the comparison to a couple of times when, like, say, Juju Lewis was on campus. This is not a criticism of Lewis, but he sort of behaved like you would sort of expect a five-star quarterback to behave. Kind of too cool for school, sort of like all of this was kind of unimpressive to him, that he was just sort of there, kind of poker face, not really revealing much in the way of emotions about any of that kind of stuff, sort of acting like a sort of a quarterback with some swagger would probably act like. I never saw a ton of that from Dylan. You know, Dylan kind of acted like a Georgia fan. When the players would come out of the tunnel to come onto the field, Dylan would stand up and sort of stand there on the aisle and watch them run out. I noticed that a few times, and body language oftentimes is kind of, I guess, misleading here. But, boy, in terms of the kind of way that you would expect a quarterback capable of making such a late decision like this perhaps to make, that's not really the body language I ever got from Dylan. I don't know how much you ever even watched him there on campus, but I saw a guy who sort of looked like he was having the time of his life. I guess that just goes to show you how misleading some of that kind of stuff can sometimes be.
Right, and, well, I think it's important to point out here once again, Dylan's a high school senior. Like, he can very understandably get caught up in the moment and the rush and euphoria that comes with sitting front row at a Georgia game and seeing Georgia go through the season that they had there. And then you can also sort of understand at the 11th hour him making an emotional decision, based on what a transfer portal quarterback Georgia might go out and pursue. So I understand all of it, and I actually think the point you make right there about his emotion and his body language that he showed on the sideline, I think sort of shows just how quickly this has all sort of come about, to where a guy who seemed very enthusiastic and excited to come to Georgia, and Dylan himself has said as much, at the 11th hour, it seems pretty clear he's going to start his college career somewhere else.
Yeah, it's really wild. All right, so let me finish with the Georgia part of this. And, Connor, it sort of feels like you have to have, like, the caveat to this discussion of Kirby Smart has figured out everything thrown at him since being Georgia coach, and there's no coach I would trust to put, like, the energy and wits towards solving complicated problems more so than Kirby Smart. He really is best positioned to figure all of this stuff out of anybody in college football. But it does sort of seem like there's a little bit of a perhaps crossroads taking place here of the fact that Georgia has really stood on principle of there's a certain way we want to use NIL, there's certain ways in which we don't want to use NIL, and I think that Georgia has been able to remain principles intact here in the early days of the NIL era. But, Connor, elite talent, especially at the premium positions, is a requisite for success. And I don't know that if Georgia is going to be able to kind of hold on to the same principles it has had of, we don't lead with NIL when it comes to a recruiting pitch or even a transfer pitch. We're not leading with NIL in that particular situation. I don't know that that philosophy is going to survive the age in which we're currently living, that Georgia, even with 2 national championships and even with the prestige of the program, is going to probably have to be in the same auction house as everybody else is if it wants the elite players, especially at premium positions going forward. What do you think about that?
Well, and that's not, and I agree with you. And it's not to say that they aren't aggressive in certain positions, but I'll go even a step further here. Look, Georgia's wide receiver recruiting is not in a good place right now. And I don't know how much that falls on Brian McClendon. I don't know how much it falls on Kirby Smart, but it was a really deep wide receiver class this year in terms of guys you could have gone out and got a lot of talented players. And, I think Sakobi White and Nitro Tuggle can be very good, productive players at Georgia, but, you look at some of the other names out there that at various times Georgia was in on, and they just ultimately end up not getting. And you go out and look, the teams that have beaten Georgia even say, how have they done it? It's with great wide receiver play. Isaiah Bond made some great plays in that Alabama game. Jermaine Burton, and I'm not putting him in the same class as some of the other ones, but he goes out and makes some big plays in that win over Georgia. Obviously, Jamison Williams, John Mechie come to mind from previous Georgia losses. You think Marvin Harrison from the Ohio State game a season ago. If you are going to, stand on principle, stand on business, is a popular thing today, what you run the risk of doing is standing a lot closer to what Clemson is right now than some of the other elite programs out there. I think Clemson finds himself where they clearly have made a miscalculation in how they have been running their program in recent years as they have taken a step back in an incredibly weak in conference, no less. It's not like, Clemson is playing an SEC level schedule. They're going out and losing 4 games in the ACC program, which, as you pointed out last week, or a conference, as you pointed out last week, wasn't good enough to get into the college football playoff, and the undefeated conference champion that had 2 wins over SEC programs. So I think if you're Georgia here, look, Kirby Smart has always been very adaptable. He's always been very flexible. I'll be interested in seeing how flexible he is moving forward because, while, yes, wide receiver is a position where you can get, production out of the transfer portal, it seems like they're going to get some more out of there this year. I think it also really, really helps to be able to land those guys as high school recruits, too, and can have them come in and develop from day one. You look at the success that Georgia has had with guys like Dylan Bell, Ladd McConkey, while, yes, you're able to pull guys out of the portal, it does take them some time, I think, to adjust to what you're doing. Whereas if you're bringing them in as freshmen right away, I think there's an easier way to sort of pick things up and go about their business there. So, when it comes to the wide receiver position, you can put the quarterback spot in there as well. I'll be very interested in seeing what Georgia does going forward.
Anything else you want to leave with this on, Connor? Kind of a final thought here of perhaps anything that hasn't been said to this point?
I think it's important to keep in mind, and I will say, I feel like there's a lot of straw men out there that are, maybe complaining about the way that fans are reacting. I would say by and large, this is actually a pretty measured response from Georgia fans that I have seen thus far. It's not doom and gloom. It's certainly not what it would have been in, say, like 2018, 2019, you think, when Justin Fields transferred out of the program. Kirby Smart has had, I'm doing the math off the top of my head here, and anytime I'm doing math, it's a dangerous game. Kirby Smart has had 4 5-star quarterbacks play for him in his time at Georgia. I believe of the 92 games that he has won as a head coach, those 5-star quarterbacks have started and won, I think, 15 games rather. This is not a program built on 5-star quarterbacks. Every one of those 5-star quarterbacks ended up finishing their college career elsewhere. I understand that Raiola is a very hyped and very talented prospect and could lead Nebraska to great success that has been missing for the better part of a decade. Georgia in the long run is probably going to be just fine. Now, again, getting into the playoff every year, being a top 12 team or being a national championship team, that's a very fine line that Georgia has to try and walk and get to. But for the most part, missing out on Dylan Raiola, as I expect them to, is not going to take Georgia from a championship contender to Clemson overnight.
Connor, really good stuff. I certainly appreciate that. We'll look forward to reading. I thought your piece this morning on, kind of the sort of the intersection of the Beck news and the Raiola news is very, very good. So we'll keep reading that from you there at DawgNation.com, and we'll chat here back on this show again very soon there as well. Thanks for being here today.
Yep, as always, it was a pleasure.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So interesting stuff there from Conor Riley on that, and I totally agree. I haven't really seen anything from Georgia fans, and obviously I follow this stuff pretty closely. I would say I'm a pretty significant lurker, if that's the right word to use here, of the online Georgia conversation. We want this to be a fan-oriented show, so understanding what fans are saying at any point in time is, kind of what I want to do. And so I think the responses you're seeing from Georgia right now are not hysterical. They're not, out of bounds. They are, I think, asking important questions of what's happening to the sport that I have loved. I think that's a fair question to ask, and I don't think you have to be the old man on the porch to kind of be wondering, hold on, college football sort of functioned one way for 100 whatever years, and now within the last couple of years, we've sort of decided that it needs to function a completely different way. Are we sure that's a good idea, or are we sure all this change is a change for the better? And are we sure that the apparatus can sort of hold together with all of this much change at any one time? I think that's a fair question to ask. I also think that college football is incredibly resilient from the standpoint that no matter how weird things seem to get, college football always seems to continue to be pretty entertaining. And I think there's an aspect of, if you wonder why sports talk, and in a roundabout way, this is what this is. Stephen A. Smith is sports talk. Barstool, that's sport. Why is sports talk popular? I think it's because it's sort of fun to take a break from your real world problems and sort of sink your teeth into trying to solve some of these interesting, complicated problems as it relates to sports. And how do you put a roster together in 2024 given the stuff that's out there right now? That's kind of an interesting problem to try to solve. And So I think that college football will survive all of this because the new stuff is interesting the same way the old stuff has kind of been. And I do genuinely trust Kirby Smart, perhaps more so than any coach, to be able to figure all of this out. But I think there is also an aspect of the stuff that will be figured out is that what has worked before isn't going to work as well going forward. And what's going to work better going forward is a little bit of a different model than what you've used in the past. And as you've also heard me say before too, clearly everybody wants to raise as much NIL money as they possibly can. And there is also a point in which you kind of bump up against your ceiling there on that. And Georgia's a very resource program. There are a lot of people who obviously love UGA. They enjoy the prestige that being a respected supporter of Georgia provides them. And Georgia has a chance to go out there and raise a lot of NIL dollars. And by the way, we have a lot of very rich people that listen to our show, certainly far richer than I am. Hey, if you want to, be a hero to a lot of Georgia fans, give big to the NIL, Classic City Collective, things like that. That's a great way to make yourself a hero for a lot of the people who are listening right now. They would love nothing more than to see you step up and help Georgia kind of, stay in the sort of money whipping business here against everybody else who sort of wants to do that to them. That's a really, really important thing for those of you with the means to be able to do. But there's also a reality here that at a certain point in time, your ability to raise money has kind of, you sort of bumped up against the ceiling on that. And the next phase for NIL, and I do believe we're kind of entering into this phase a little bit. The next phase is how you choose to allocate that money. And this is the part where it gets sort of unpleasant. And I don't mean to say it like this, but, the days of everybody at the University of Utah gets a 2-year lease on a Ford F-150 or a Ram truck or whatever that is. I don't know that the future of NIL is 85 guys all getting the same thing quite as much. In fact, to be able to pay for the sort of multi-million-dollar deals, we're led to believe the top players are demanding and collecting right now. That may mean so-and-so gets nothing. And I hate that, right? Because if it was up to me, every Georgia player would get millions and millions of dollars because I think they all deserve it. They clearly have made my life very enjoyable. I'd love to see them all collect financial windfall on that. But there's a certain aspect of this, which is, you've heard me say this before, sort of a Pareto's Law type thing, an 80-20 principle. In order to give the small number of true difference makers the money they deserve, so to speak, that means so-and-so probably gets nothing to help make sure that the other so-and-so gets everything that he should get. In fact, if you follow golf and like PGA Tour, and why the PGA Tour has had such a weird business model and trying to compete with like LIV that's going to come on the scene and things like that. Obviously, LIV has, huge, outsized funding. But the PGA Tour model is, a lot of people tell you, the top golfers have gotten too little over the course of years because the sort of bottom rung of the golfers have kind of gotten too much. And I think that college football may be dealing with its own version of that in the NIL space of, well, if you want to give quarterback, edge rusher, left tackle, top wide receiver, if you want to give them the sort of 7-figure sum they probably could command in the open market, that may mean some of the guys on your roster perhaps in the future don't get anything. That's an unpleasant aspect of the NIL conversation, but I believe it is the next phase of this. Once you've raised all the money you can, how do you choose to allocate it? And there's not going to be enough to go around for everybody in that particular sense. I believe that's where we're heading. It's also pretty late here. So let me quickly do a Royal Caribbean mention here from the standpoint of, hey, if you want to have some fun, you want to kind of put all the stuff behind NIL and stuff like that behind you. Obviously, Royal Caribbean gives you a great chance to do that in 2024. One of the things in particular I want you to keep in mind is the great new debut of Utopia of the Seas coming up in July. It's right, another brand new Royal Caribbean ship sets sail in July. It's an Oasis-class ship. That means one of the largest categories of ships at sea, and it's exclusively going to Port Canaveral for those 3- and 4-night sailings. If you like long weekends, if you like short cruises that still give you a chance to experience the best that Royal Caribbean has to offer, including a stopover at Perfect Day Coco Cay, a brand new Oasis-class ship starting in July on Utopia of the Seas. That's a great way to do it. Our friend Jessica Slater can tell you more about this. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her at jslater@dreamvacations.com. All right, we've gone very long. Let me just do one story here today. I'm going to save some of this other stuff for later. So what's interesting about the Raiola to Nebraska story is it seems to coincide with another quarterback rumor that's also out there as well. I know that Julian Fleming, the former Ohio State wide receiver, along with former Buckeyes quarterback Kyle McCord, they both visited Nebraska this past weekend. And it's sort of thought right now, at least it has been conventional wisdom, that Nebraska the most likely landing spot for McCord. And no one has stepped up to say this is no longer true. We heard Pete Thamel, we gave this to you earlier in the show, that, hey, Nebraska was still offering the scholarship to its current commit, an in-state prospect. So therefore they're speaking out on that. There's no rumors or leaks as it relates to McCord. So this idea that Raiola is leaving Georgia because he's upset because he thinks Carson Beck is coming back, well, if he's going to a place that is also going to have another experienced quarterback, that sort of stands to reason that might not be true. Now, McCord was no great shakes for Ohio State this year. Maybe Raiola feels like over the course of a couple of months he'll have a chance to beat him out. Perhaps he will. Certainly a better chance of doing that at Nebraska than he would have ever had of beating out a Carson Beck at Georgia. That simply was not going to happen, barring injury, and I'm not even quite so sure I'd favor Raiola over Gunnar Stockton in the future quarterback competition for what it's worth. But nonetheless, it's an interesting kind of another sort of news item that's out there is the school that Raiola is perhaps leaning towards and moving towards is a school that could also be taking a transfer quarterback this year, former Ohio State quarterback Kyle McCord. So something to keep in mind there. We'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean, and we'll kind of save the other stories for later on, including, by the way, state championships continuing at Mercedes-Benz Stadium today. Shout out to Prince Avenue Christian, obviously won in the Single A Division I game yesterday. DeMello Jones, I thought it had a very nice game, though, for Swainsboro, but ultimately Prince Avenue kind of got it done there, and I guess Bowden won the Division II game there, too. So shouts out there. Action continues today and tomorrow on all of that, and we will we'll cover that some perhaps tomorrow. Let me also give a shout-out here as well for those of you coming into the Atlanta area to want to do some Christmas shopping here this time of year. Perhaps you have friends who are not Georgia fans or coming in for the Peach Bowl, something like that. Great chance to spend some holiday time here in the Atlanta area. Is right here, nestled right next to where our DawgNation World Headquarters studios are located here in Dunwoody. In fact, we're right between two great MARTA stations. It gives you easy access from the airport or to Buckhead or to downtown, and a great way to enjoy a couple of thousand hotel rooms, which means you can get some great savings, a couple of hundred restaurants, which means you can choose all kinds of cuisines and sort of, fine dining, quick service, whatever you would prefer there on that. Shopping galore, great shopping experiences all around to get those perfect holiday gifts for you and those that you love. So check out discoverdunwoody.com/DawgNation for more on that. That's discoverdunwoody.com/DawgNation for more on that. All right, and as we wrap up today with a golden shoe, I can promise you this golden shoe was a lot funnier when it was first sent to me than it perhaps is right now, because it's making fun of Florida losing a player, and when this came out, we weren't quite so aware that Georgia was also perhaps on the verge of losing a high-profile player. Mad Dog sent it to me. This is real, by the way, just in time for the holidays. It's one of these sporting goods stores, and it's a Florida jersey that's Trevor Etienne. Yeah, I don't know how many Florida fans are buying the Trevor Etienne jersey here right now, so fun to make fun of the lousy, stinking Gators, but admittedly a little less fun to do that when it's Georgia also on the verge of losing an elite prospect right now when it comes to Dylan Raiola. We will say this, though, that while Georgia may have some problems every now and then, nothing like those lousy, stinking Gators who've now gone 1,130 days without beating Georgia. You love to see that. That is our Gator Hater Updater. So we'll keep following this news. We'll talk to you about it again tomorrow. Thanks for being here. DawgNation Daily, presented by ESOG. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. You can trust them on all of that. And I guess I'll ask you to get us started here today. How did we do in terms of addressing sort of the big issues as it relates to this? I will let you share your thoughts there on that. Any open issues we haven't fully, properly addressed yet, we'll give you a chance to do that there too. All right. On Facebook to begin today, and we'll just sort of see where this conversation goes here. Joseph Kennedy says that Matt Rule is the Grinch that stole Christmas. Certainly feels like the way. Derek Tillman, the subject of Ellis Robinson, supposed to be practicing with Georgia. Yeah, I mean, a huge number of the Georgia players are early enrollees, which is fun. Robinson has sort of reaffirmed his pledge there to UGA, so you really like that. You really like that. Let's see what else. Eric DeVornsey said, heading to the bins to cheer on those Perry Panthers, hopefully bringing back their first state title. Yeah, fun to see Perry in the state championship today against Stockbridge. That should be a fun game. Mike Mazzell said his boss called another meeting right during the show. Mike, I'm sorry to hear that, but so sorry to hear that. But I'm glad you're here right now, at least, or at least you were here earlier. But sorry you had to leave. Also mentioning the fact that Ryan Puglisi looks like, I think our buddy Rusty shared a photo of Puglisi kind of signing, his paperwork. Looks like he's on his way to Georgia. And there are a lot of people who like Ryan Puglisi. Now, the one thing I'm going to try not to do is, I feel like there's a lot of propaganda in recruiting, and I'm a very pro-UGA guy. Of course, y'all know that's true. But I'm also kind of self-aware from the standpoint that it would be a pretty bad look for me, I would say, to kind of pivot right away to, well, Georgia doesn't need Dylan Raiola. They've already got Ryan Puglisi. Now, there are a lot of people who like Ryan Puglisi, and they always have. But I'm also kind of aware of the fact that it just sort of looks weird to be like, nothing to worry about when it comes to Dylan Raiola. Puglisi is the better player anyway. Now, there's a chance that would have gone on to be true. I mean, I think that, when Alabama, for instance, signed 2 quarterbacks in 2017, at the college level anyway, Mac Jones is the one that won a national championship as a season-long starter, something that Tua Tagovailoa didn't do. So sometimes the second quarterback in a class does go on to have more success, and it wouldn't be the biggest surprise in the world if Puglisi, who's a 4-star in his own right, had done that in comparison to Raiola, had Raiola come here. There are plenty of people who would have told you they liked plenty about what Ryan Puglisi brings to the table. But at the same time, I'm sort of aware, a little bit self-aware of what kind of comes across feeling a little bit like propaganda, and so we want to be careful about some of that kind of stuff. Let's see what else. Daniel Irvin Wales says, imagine how giddy we are all going to be when Beck, Bowers, and Ladd all hold a joint presser telling us they're all coming back just because they love UGA so much. He says Dylan's going to be a distant memory by then. And he gives you a big smiley face emoji. Yeah, that would obviously be very nice. And, one way or another, I mean, the one thing that Georgia football shows you is that all players eventually become distant memory. And so, while the Raiola thing is red hot right now and worth discussing and worth debating, it is also one of those things that eventually something will happen. Then whether it be, perhaps maybe more Beck McConkey as more likely options, but something's going to happen that sort of returns the focus to where it maybe needs to be. Let's see what else. Yeah, Gary Holt, Jacob O'Neill. Yeah, not calling into the state championship games. That's not really my network. Our buddy Rusty's doing a couple of those, but that's not really my network. Let me go to YouTube here for a moment and see what they're saying over there. We'll see how folks are doing. Paul Moon, the subject of losing Justice Haynes a year ago. Yeah, I don't fully understand the Haynes thing in Alabama. I guess Saban has a history of kind of favoring more experienced running backs, I guess. But, Caleb Downs, the other Georgia prospect that got away a year ago, has kind of proven to be every bit the player you think he would have been, but a much different set of circumstances when it comes to Justice Haynes. Frank Patterson says, with Dylan leaving, that gives us more room for Juju Lewis. Yeah, maybe that's the case, but honestly, I mean, I think that there's probably a better chance that Lewis leaves the state of Georgia at some point in time during his high school career than there is that he actually goes to UGA. I know the game we had for Julian against Walton the other night, he was wearing the Georgia towel, but y'all know this, towels and mouthpieces and things like that are typically false positives. I don't know that I would favor Georgia among any. I mean, look, he's committed to USC. Even if the USC thing falls apart, he took a visit to Ohio State a couple of weeks ago. I don't know how seriously I would take the Georgia, Juju relationship here right now. Obviously, Georgia is going to recruit all elite quarterbacks for the most part. But Lewis is just a little bit of a different type of deal, just a little bit of a different thing. I mean, to me, it sort of feels like they kind of hit the ground running with him to begin his high school career last year as a freshman, already with a kind of a well-planned out thought about how all of this might play out, and probably they were wise to do so, I guess. I don't hold that against them necessarily. I would say they're clearly pretty aware of what, his talents are perhaps worth. Aaron Dixon on the subject of Kirby and roster management and Ra Thomas. Yeah, Aaron, I would say that my evaluation of Ra is a little different than yours is. I think Ra is a pretty good player. And, I think that obviously he had some injury issues. I think one of the issues that may have also been true with Ra is because he played in such a different offense at Mississippi State, I think maybe Georgia was a little slow to use him maybe at the beginning of the year. And I would say that when you bring in that kind of talent, which I believe that Ra, big body guy, good talent, I think that, you got to try to find out some way to use him while he's in the process of kind of learning offense, things like that. Combat Engineer says, are we going to lose Dylan? Yeah, Combat, I would say right now it seems more likely than not that's probably true. Maybe there could be sort of a late thing that changes that, but it certainly seems like that way right now. Danny German says that Pug looks like he may have Beck's skill set with a run threat to boot. That's a good way to describe it. That would certainly be fun. Paul Moon on the subject of KJ being in Dylan's ear. I mean, the one thing we know is, and I don't listen, this is going to sound like I'm being spiteful. I don't necessarily mean for it to be. Boy, Dylan didn't make much of an impact on this 2024 class for Georgia, did he? I mean, the idea of, trying to recruit KJ Bolden, as a teammate of Bolden, really very little impact on that at all. I mean, I think we've kind of heard there's really nobody thinking about not coming to Georgia on the heels of what might be a Raiola decision here, which gives you an idea of, I guess, just how, I don't know. Maybe I won't say that. But, I mean, just sort of gives you an idea of how much this class was not really influenced as much by the quarterback as sometimes you're used to sort of seeing. Foster Moss, yeah, I did see a lot of DeMello Jones last night. So when all this stuff started going down and when the Prince Swainsboro game was going on, my daughter had a big gymnastics banquet last night. So I was in the midst of trying to do all of that. And so that was clearly, divided attention. But I was trying to watch, DeMello. I thought he looked really good. Really good. And I'll be starting to follow this Raiola stuff, which was obviously not very good. Emperor says these portal guys we brought to a visit need to come on and commit and make me feel better with some news. And they also mentioned the idea of Bowers. Yeah, Brock Bowers not staying. I mean, maybe McConkey stays. I'd love for that to be true. Beck hopefully stays. But, y'all, Brock Bowers going to be a top 5 pick or top 10 pick. That's not a guy that's coming back. Paul Moon also mentioning if this happens, it's the most Buford story ever. Yeah, I mean, I try to not to say that kind of stuff too much, but boy, hard not to draw the same kind of conclusion here. I mean, this guy moved to Georgia as a Georgia commit, spends 7 months at Buford, and all of a sudden now he's going somewhere else. It's just hard not to draw that conclusion. I mean, I say that kiddingly, but hard not to draw that conclusion a little bit. Jamie Scott says, does the class stay number 1 without Dylan Raiola in it? I'm not as good at the math stuff, but I think it probably will. But I'm not as good at the math stuff. Morris Rich says it's not fun to lose a player like Raiola, especially this late. I would agree with that. Doggy says it has to be that Dylan felt a little slighted at how desperate Kirby seemed to be to find money to keep back. I mean, what evidence do we have that Kirby's desperate to do anything? I mean, Carson Beck would have sort of an open market value as a starting quarterback. We've kind of all come to understand that. I don't believe it's what Matt Rule says it is perhaps for anybody. A lot of that kind of stuff is still exaggerated because the people who are doing the exaggerating benefit from the exaggeration. But, I mean, I don't know that Georgia's got NIL funds. It's just simply a matter of how it chooses to use them. So I don't know that there's any evidence that Kirby was desperate at all as it relates to Beck. Randy Hall mentioning this. I did see this. So Clay Webb, and I honestly had even forgotten all about this. So I guess he goes to Jacksonville State. Jacksonville State had a good team this year. Of course, Jacksonville State had a good team this year. And Clay Webb, who obviously had sort of a weird career at Georgia, but he was like second-team All-American for Jacksonville State this year, which was good for him. Or at least one of the services had him as All-American, which was good. Good for him. DT says allowing one to be strong-armed once is to signal that you can be strong-armed again by the same entity and others. I believed and lived this in business and personal relationships, and it served me well. I think it's an interesting point. And so here's what I'll tell you. And once again, I try to talk to people who know more than I do because it's important to have people in your life that know more than you do. And so one of the things I've been sort of told from time to time is, like, every now and then there's one of these, like, sort of mid-level recruitments that don't get a ton of attention, and you think the guy might come to Georgia, and at the last minute, this sort of doesn't happen, but it also doesn't register very much. Like, I'm not going to cite an example here because I don't want to, I just don't want to. But the kind of thing where it sort of seems like so-and-so player from so-and-so state is sort of trending to Georgia, and then the announcement happens, he ends up going somewhere else. And so sometimes you're left to wonder, well, what happened there? And you don't really care all that much because it's not like some player that you're necessarily like all that fired up about, but it just sort of seems like everything was sort of moving in this direction, then it wasn't. What I've been told a couple times is that, maybe there was some thought, no, of course you can't do NIL stuff until, after, that has not been a factor in recruitment, not allowed to be. But, once Georgia's interest became obvious and known, well, all of a sudden then it kind of ponied up the in-state school to kind of get its act together and get its offer together, whatever you're allowed to do within the rules or whatever. And so, sometimes Georgia's presence in one of these recruiting battles has been a little bit of a negotiating against itself type of situation. That the presence of Georgia kind of got the in-state school or the other school in the recruitment, as it were, sort of a little bit more involved. And all of a sudden now they had the leverage required to say, hey, if you want us to beat Georgia with this recruit, you got to do this, you got to do that, and you got to do that. All of a sudden the boosters were a little bit more on the hook to kind of get that done. And so part of the reason, to go back to DT's point, that sometimes we sort of hear, well, Georgia doesn't lead with NIL as part of its recruiting pitch. Part of the reason why is because when you're the behemoth in one of these recruiting battles, all you're doing is negotiating against yourself. And when you kind of show yourself, hey, we're going to do what it takes to get it done, well, all you're doing at that point in time is driving up the price. And, from Nebraska's standpoint, if they really are going to come in here and try to swoop in and steal this from Georgia, then doing it late is probably the only way to do it. Randy Glass says, I'm more concerned about the impact this Raiola thing will have with wide receiver recruiting. We can succeed with Raiola for sure, but our wide receiver recruiting is becoming a bad meme. Maybe Kirby Smart is sold on the portal for wide receivers. Well, a couple of things there on that. Once again, I am not trying to speak ill of the soon-to-be decommitted, but Raiola didn't make a squat's worth of difference on any wide receiver. Not whatsoever. I mean, so with all due respect to Mr. Raiola, the idea that he was going to have some sort of huge negative impact on wide receivers, he didn't have a positive impact on wide receivers. Nycar decommitted. Nitro Truggle was visiting LSU this weekend. Scovie White would have come to Georgia no matter what because Scovie's a great guy. You're going to love Scovie White. I tell you, you're going to love Scovie White. The Jeremiah Smiths and all those guys. None of that ever became, real in any Ryan Wingo. None of that ever became real in any true, tangible way. There was no positive impact by Raiola on any of Georgia's wide receiver recruitment. Now, as far as favoring guys from the portal, that may be the case. I liked Dominic Lovett this season for UGA. I love the thought of him coming back for 2024. I liked Ra Thomas. I really did. I love the idea of him returning for UGA. And I was kind of thinking about this. So think about, for those of you who like Major League Baseball. And, if the Braves, like late summer, were to put out a poll of, hey, do you want us to hold on to our best prospects and build for the future, or do you want to trade them from some like frontline starting pitcher and try to win now? If you put that kind of poll out to, Braves fans during the summer, or really any Major League Baseball fans, professional sports fans like that, for the most part, fans are kind of always in favor of win now. And from that standpoint, I think some fans may actually like what college football is moving towards, because I do believe we are moving towards a win-now sport where the idea that you bring in Zeed Haynes, you develop him for a couple of years. No, you don't. You don't have the opportunity to do that. The idea that you bring in maybe even like a Dylan Raiola, you develop him for a couple of years. For the most part, no, you don't. You're not doing that. That for now, the only recruits that truly matter are the ones that can help you right away. And anybody else, you're just sort of hoping to be able to keep them, but odds are you might not be able to, conceding the likelihood that a lot of these guys are going to leave. So a lot of fans sort of have a win-now mentality anyway. They don't want to trust the process, as has been used as a phrase before. They want to go out there and put a team on the field that can compete for a championship right away. And if you can't do that, then the future doesn't really matter because the future's later. Well, in a roundabout way, that may be what college football is moving towards, which is between the recruits that I can sign, who can help me right away, the transfers I can go out and get, who can help me right away, the current guys that have been playing, who next year really could make an impact that helps me win games. And I hate to say it this way, who's just a guy that could be more easily replaced? Having a real sense of who's a win-now player and who's either just a guy or somebody whose moment's going to come into the future, boy, it sort of feels like we're kind of moving into sort of a win-now age of the only thing that matters is who can help me right now, and the future's going to figure out itself and take care of itself. And a lot of fans sort of like win-now, mentality anyway. All right, let me go back to Facebook. Kyle and Susan Richter says, just my humble opinion, I wish we would have gone after Air Nolan. Yeah, it's really interesting that Georgia did not really do that. Georgia was never really involved in the Nolan recruitment at all, even before Nolan went to Ohio State. Georgia just was not really a factor in all of that. And obviously that's based on somebody's evaluation there. But what it leads me – now I will say that when I saw Air this year, he was probably hurt. He did not have a great game against Rome in the playoffs, which was the game I got a chance to see Nolan in person for this year. This was not nearly the same Langston Hughes team this year it was a year ago either. That's probably true and fair to say as well. So I don't believe I saw the best of Nolan. He made a couple of really nice throws when I saw him, but I think he was probably hurt. That's just I'm not a doctor. That was just my read on the situation. I don't believe he was anywhere near as impressive seeing him as a senior as he was when I saw him as a junior, but I believe he was probably injured. That may have been the reason why. But the other point that your comment makes me think about is this. And once again, this is sort of Monday morning quarterbacking when it comes to recruiting. I'll be honest with you. I'll acknowledge this. But so if we're gonna say if Raiola does end up going to Nebraska, maybe he changes his mind. But if it's trending this way right now, if we're gonna say, hey, what you gonna do? Raiola had the family tie. His dad went there. His uncle's getting paid all this money as the offensive line coach. Long time, emotional, relational tie to Nebraska. What are you going to do about that? Then it might serve as a reminder that when possible, Georgia might also want to seek out a few more recruitments that kind of come with a little bit of a built-in emotional tie, home state type tie. And once again, no one can find fault with any of Georgia's recruiting. They're clearly an elite recruiting program. It's why they've won, as of now, the last 2 national championships. Obviously a streak that comes to an end here this year, but the success has been built on the back of the recruiting. So you can't find fault with Georgia's recruiting. But, Georgia's very, very comfortable recruiting in sort of an unemotional way. Hey, choose us because we're the best option, not because we're your favorite team or we're your home state or anything like that. And if you lose Raiola and the emotional tie the Raiola family had to Nebraska kind of plays a role in that, then, perhaps some of that could be avoided with a little bit more in-state recruiting on your own. I'm just suggesting as a possibility. Yeah, Justice Haynes is an example of that, I guess, kind of getting away and going the wrong way. William Camacho says if Kirby can put a good defense together for this upcoming season, then we've got a good shot of beating the Gumps in Tuscaloosa. Yeah, that's important to keep in mind is that if Beck returns, if Georgia figures out some of this kind of stuff with its defense, then Dylan Raiola was not really a 2024 story for Georgia anyway. That Georgia's ultimate story is more about kind of what it's doing to get ready for this upcoming season. The Raiola story would be something more about the future. That's, I think, important to keep in mind. I just see a preview of getting a chance to talk to Jake Fromm a little bit later on this week. But let's see what else. Let me go back across all the various comment sections. We'll get ready to wrap it up after that. Julie C. says, doesn't it make you wonder why Dylan didn't draw the wide receivers to UGA. Yeah, I mean, the idea that there was some sort of like huge coattails for a quarterback like this. In the case of Dylan, that wasn't true necessarily. Now, I don't know that you should, take that as a bad thing about Dylan necessarily, but it is just a fact. Brandon Holtz mentioning the Riley Leonard to Notre Dame, or as he calls him, Notre Dame. If that's a done deal, that's like the worst kept secret out there. I mean, Riley Leonard was kind of always thought to be going to Notre Dame. Is this done? Yeah, it looks like it is done now. Yeah, the Leonard thing. Yeah, that's a done deal now. That's kind of like the worst kept secret of them all. Of all the quarterbacks and the transfer destinations, it seems like in the case of Leonard, he's sort of only considered Notre Dame. And one of the things that kind of been talked about was the fact that people kind of bring up is there tampering, is there not? The fact that Leonard, even before he even entered the transfer portal, was sort of thought to be heading towards Notre Dame. Sort of an example of kind of some of that. Frank Patterson excited about the future of Lawson Lucky. I'm looking forward to that. Let's see what else. RKD says we need offense just as much as defense. But the truth is, RKD, Georgia's offense this year was better than its defense. I mean, I would say that the last 2 years, Georgia's offense was perhaps underrated in comparison to the defense. But this year, Georgia's offense was better than the defense. Bo Hooper says Raiola flipped on Ohio State, about to flip on UGA. I have a suspicion that after going 8-4 in Nebraska and freezing sheer wins, he'll hit the portal. Don't get too comfy, Huskers. Yeah, I mean, as I said before, I don't know that I necessarily, put a lot on him by the fact that he's made a decommitment decision and transferred high schools a good bit. I do think that one of the things that a lot of athletes mistake, and a lot of families from athletes probably mistake a little bit too, is the idea that outcomes can be controlled. That, well, if I go here, I can manipulate the situation. I feel like this is to me, the thing that's like plagued LeBron James' career, and I know y'all don't come to me for my hot NBA takes, but I think LeBron's biggest mistake in life has been assuming that I can control outcomes by like changing situations, changing teammates, changing coaches, changing organizations. The truth is, outcomes are very difficult to control. You can make predictions about outcomes, but you can't control outcomes very much. And I think sometimes recruits do that. If I move to Georgia, or if I do this or I do that, I can kind of control the outcome a little bit more. But outcomes can't really be controlled. There's a little bit too much of that. I would say sometimes with some of this. Christopher Black says Riley Leonard has the height, but his stats are extremely pedestrian. I would say that Leonard is a little bit more of an accomplished runner than thrower right now. I would say that he was also, first of all, he got hurt. So you got, in terms of the overall stats, some of those season-long stat lines impacted by the fact that he was hurt. I would say go back and watch the Clemson game. To me, that kind of showed you the player that he's capable of being. Probably more of a runner than thrower right now. But I thought he had a really good game against Clemson. And he got hurt, which sort of took some of the kind of juice off of him a little bit. But I think he's, I think he's an interesting player, certainly going to Notre Dame. Someone like Sam Hartman, I sort of feel like was a little bit more of a system-type player specific to the Dave Clawson system there at Wake Forest. I think there's a chance that Riley Leonard could be more successful at Wake Forest than Sam Hartman was. John Adams wondering if Georgia will slip if Raiola does officially lead the class. Mathematically, I haven't heard anybody say that, but I'm also not that good at the math on this. Lance D says Georgia's quarterback stable will be good regardless of what Raiola does. Stockton and Puglisi will be more than capable. We've seen in the past where that wasn't true. I think about some of the previous years. Yeah, I mean, even with Raiola potentially leaving, the Georgia quarterback sort of progression, I would say, has gotten a lot more sensible in recent years. I think that's probably true. Lou says that anybody that commits somewhere else is money hungry, not that good. Anybody that commits to UGA is a hard worker who just wants to win. Certainly seems like that's the prevailing wisdom of plenty of fans. Which is why, trying not to trash Raiola too much. I mean, I don't think you have to like this situation. I don't. This is a little bit unorthodox, even if financially it makes some sense from his standpoint. It's a little bit unorthodox. I don't think you have to sort of stand there and cheer every single thing that every single person does. I don't think you have to do that. But we also try not to come down too hard on these guys there as well. All right, let's see what else. A couple more comments. Back on Facebook for a moment, then I'll go back to DawgNation.com. Clarence Ross says Raiola not a true George boy, so who cares? Gary Holt checking out. Gary, appreciate you being here. Tennille Calvino, thanks for the kind words. Betty Power says she loves her Georgia Bulldogs. I like that. William Camacho checking out for today. Appreciate that. Scott Gentry says we need to put a lot of our focus on beefing up the lines. Yeah, I'm going to tell you right now, let's say we took Matt Rule at his word. Oh, you got to have $1.5 million to get a quarterback right now. Well, guess what? If I had $1.5 million right now, I believe I might spend it on Walter Nolan. No disrespect to Dylan Raiola. No disrespect. Raiola is a very specific kind of prospect, though. And, I think that when you watch the way in which mobile quarterbacks are having success in college football, I don't quite know that Raiola is going to fit that mold as much, going forward. So while I'd love to have Dylan here, and I think that he's clearly, as a 5-star quarterback, clearly worth some money, of course. But in terms of, boy, you got to do whatever you can. You got to bid whatever it takes to get a guy like this. Well, if money's unlimited, I believe I want to buy some ready-made day one impact defensive linemen. I believe that's what I would want to see Georgia spend its money on right now. Jacob O'Neill getting ready for the Pierce County State Championship game. Jacob, hope you enjoy that. Let's see what else. Let me go to DawgNation.com for a minute. LA Dog gives you go dogs. Appreciate that, LA. He also reminds us to hold on tight to what really matters most. LA, that's a very, very wise set of words. It sure is. Michigan Dog says, I'm just glad we're going to have 2 quarterbacks that are a run threat. Yeah, I mean, when you watch the way in which running quarterbacks have been such a problem for Georgia and really everybody else, it does sort of make you wonder, well, does that mean in the future that Georgia would also be better off, having that threat of the run? Now, Carson Beck had a great year this year, kind of only running on occasion, but boy, to have that extra dimension to the offense could be very valuable in the future. Randy Hall, I don't have specifics on the Mims injury. We obviously haven't heard a lot from Georgia since then, so I don't know if that was a re-aggravation of the ankle or not. I don't know that. I'm sure we'll get more of that. We'll probably hear from Georgia again. I guess we may hear from Kirby on Wednesday, right? So Kirby will probably give you a little bit on Wednesday, maybe. Typically we'll do that. And then after that, you'll hear from him probably the 27th or so. That's probably your next times to hear from Kirby. Brandon Griffin says, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Our offense was elite this year. Just picked the wrong game to not execute and turn the ball over. And injuries, yeah. And listen, when you go look at the 2 years of success for Georgia national championships and the offensive success in particular, the thing that was the catalyst for a lot of that, the underrated aspect of a lot of that, was the performance of the Georgia offensive line. And unfortunately, against Alabama, it's really, I believe, the success that Alabama had up front defensively that kind of upended the typical Georgia success that we've been used to seeing. Richard D. says, if each state retained its own elite players, which state would produce the college football national champion? Certainly a lot of us think that Georgia would have a very good shot on all of that. South GA Dog says, we lost Nye Carr after Raiola committed. That makes you go, Yeah, I mean, and Carr is another one of these guys that sort of a late NIL type deal, there on him. That's just sort of what it is. And, yeah, I mean, when it comes to premium position, starting with quarterback, the most premium position, and then looking at things that impact the quarterback, offensive tackles that protect the quarterback, wide receivers that receive the ball from the quarterback, edge rushers that sack the quarterback, cornerbacks that step in front of passes from the quarterback, all of the positions that have extra importance because of their connection one way or another to the quarterback, those are becoming the NIL positions, and sort of figuring out how you kind of function in that space is pretty important. All right, anything else? Let's try one more trip around here and we'll get ready to go. Frank Patterson wants to pay Mims and Tate so we get more WWF highlights. They had their kind of like tag team moment at one point in time this season. Brian Benninghoff says, you folks who think this is a game played on the field, you are fools. This is a game played 365, 24/7 off the field with 18-year-old grown men who feel entitled to millions of dollars. I mean, that's obviously, to a certain extent, there's clearly an off-field element to this that goes on every single moment of every single day. That's true. But, I mean, there is still an element of you got to go on the field and show what you're all about there, too, which is one of the reasons why Georgia's had the success that it has had. Crow King 123 says that developing depth is important. It helps prevent injuries from impacting you. Our stupidity of playing two hurt guys in the SEC championship instead of relying on the depth we developed was our undoing. Maybe that's the case, but a couple of things there on that, Crow King. Moving forward, I'm not quite so sure if any team, especially a team like Georgia that's really relied on like elite depth, I'm not sure how much there's of that to go around in the future, just given the free mobility that exists for players who are not happy with their current playing time. And as far as the decision to, rely a lot on Bowers and McConkey during the SEC championship as opposed to other folks, could be something to that. Could be that perhaps other players maybe should have been a little bit larger part of the game plan. That could be a fair criticism. All right. We're going to go for now. Bobby Mean says, could you see Julian Fleming coming to UGA? That would be a huge get. Maybe that's the case, Bobby, but I will say that the reports were that when Kyle McCord visited Nebraska, Fleming went with him. So could be another example of somebody else's NIL dollars spending a little bit more robustly. But, according to one of these websites, they had what's his name? London Humphreys ranked as a far better transfer anyway. So obviously there's a lot to like about Fleming. It seems like Georgia recruited him pretty hard before. Fleming had a pretty good game against Georgia last December. But I don't know that's in the cards here right now, but maybe it could be. All right. Good stuff. Obviously not a fun topic, but we'll keep following it and see where it goes. Y'all check out RS Andrews online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised. The price is promised. You can trust them on all of that, including getting your heating system ready to go. Christmas, winter, cold weather. Stay toasty and warm with a heating system that has some new life breathed into that old unit that may need to be replaced eventually, but perhaps another good winter and another good cold weather season with that old unit. Our friends at RS Andrews can show you how. So find them online, rsandrews.com, for a lot more on that. Y'all have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll look forward to talking to you then.